done the hard bit, the hard yards, the hard miles. We're on day 5. It's the weekend coming up. But before we quit for those 2 days of well-deserved rest, I want you to get to kind of 3:30, 4 o'clock and reflect on what you've achieved this week, because you've done some big things. You've brought the big guns out. You've changed the game, because we're so accustomed to summer and sunshine and hanging out in the park and running like Theresa May through cornfields. Acutely aware that I said Theresa like a 3-year-old child. That's fine. We all have our quirks. But when we get to sort of 4 o'clock, I don't want you just to be reflecting. I want you to be previewing what's coming up next week. And I don't want you to do it through fear. And I don't want you to do it as if it's an encumbrance. It's like, oh God, it's the Sunday scaries on a Friday. Who wants that? I don't think that's what it's about. I think what it's all about is approaching the new week with excitement, with courage, with resilience, with dynamism, and with determination. And from a determination standpoint, I wanted to share with you a story. Nobody wants to talk about work today. Gosh, bad enough actually having to do it without having somebody preaching it. Monday, this is all about determination. Right, I want to tell you a little story. There is a tiny little airfield, Cloverfield, Santa Monica in California. Not the boulevard, this is an airfield we're talking about. And I want you to cast your mind back 95 years to when you were a small, well, maybe teenager. And this is the days of biplanes and do. And, you know, if a plane could reach a speed of 70 miles an hour, you're doing pretty well. We're not talking about the Airbus A380s. We're not talking about trips to the Maldives. We're talking about not a million miles away from when the Wright brothers actually got off a plane in the air, right? So this is rudimentary stuff. And with that in mind, I want you to think about a freelance pilot who has recently spent a lot of money on getting his own plane, his pride and joy, beautiful. And he's enlisted the help of a mechanic who goes by the name of Frank Jensen. Now, this chap looks over the plane, he does a full service, and he's a meticulous guy, he's disciplined. And he notices that a bolt thread is damaged on one of the wheels. There are 2 wheels on the landing gear. And he's like, crikey, better get back to the hangar and replace this bolt. So he takes the bolt and he pops to the hangar. And while he's doing that, this freelance pilot gets an ask from one of his colleagues at the airfield saying, can you come up with this Pathé photographer and shoot this wing walker who's going to, in midair, change planes? What the? And so, all right, so we think about our day to day and we're like, yeah, it's tough. You know, I've got a difficult conversation to have with somebody, or I've got one more car to sell, or if those corn on the cobs don't leave the aisle in the next few days, we're going to have to put them on deep discount. You know, they're not really big deals. And by the way, sorry about the lighting, but I'm sort of hot stepping today. So you just get what you're given. While this guy is in the hangar, the freelance pilot gets this shout. And he's like, sure, no problem at all. I've just had there's a bit of a miscommunication. I've just had my plane fully serviced. We're good to go. They get $20 at this age to go up and do the shooting. $20 in 26 is quite big money. You know, you're not going to turn it down. So he gets in his plane and starts taxiing down the runway, and planes go up. And the guy comes out of the hangar with this new bolt. What are we going to do? Plane's in the air. The landing gear is effectively null and void. So the plane's in the air and it's 1,500 feet, you know, doing its customary 70 miles an hour. What do I do? There's guys on the runway. They've found by now this wheel and they're holding the wheel aloft, giving it all this. Do not try and land, because if you do, you'll flip the plane and it'll be devastation, and the Pathé photographer won't come out of it too well either. So, you know, it's got a lot of implications. So what they do, there's a guy called Al Johnson who is the wing walker. I believe he's also a singer, but it's not the same guy. So he goes up in a plane and they execute this plan, which is he's going to move onto the beleaguered plane. So he's going to do that plane switch, but obviously in real life, this ain't no stunt anymore. This is life and death things. So at 70 miles an hour, 1,500 feet, he moves on to this plane without the landing gear. Freelance pilot is obviously bricking it at this stage. He doesn't know what to do with himself. And Al has this idea that they'll bring another plane up with a new wheel. In midair, they'll dangle with a rope this new wheel. Al will then go underneath, get his bolts and spanners and, ratchet it back on, and all will be well. Well, in real life, there's this physical term called wind resistance. And so somehow, even the act of bringing up the wheel in a biplane and lowering it down to Al, who's going to be stood outside of the cockpit and trying to pick hold of this wheel, even that in itself is tough enough. And the rope goes down and he reaches for it, and the rope goes taut because of the wind resistance. And the pilot above, who's dangling down the wheel, thinks that's Al catching the wheel and then drops the rope. But it ain't. It's physics, and the wheel plummets to the ground. Now, the wind resistance is intolerable because it's 70 miles an hour, 1,500 feet. There are a lot of environmental factors that are making this very difficult. So they have this idea that they go and get another wheel, but tireless, and that will reduce the weight, and therefore it will make it easier to hitch it down. So effectively a carbon copy, but without the rubber on it. Again, happens again. And obviously fuel gauge is creeping down all the time. This is terrifying stuff. Plane comes up, dangle the wheel down, and Al this time collects it without the tyre. Now, this is obviously going to have implications on landing. You need the rubber because that removes a lot of the impurity of the landing, and it makes the landing a lot easier. And the scuff, and when you touch the runway, it absorbs a lot of the heat and it creates a smoother landing. But anyway, they are where they are. They've got a wheel, they haven't got a tyre. But you do what you do with what you've got. He takes the wire down to the axle where it should be sitting to essentially replace the landing gear, put 2 full wheels back on, 1 minus rubber. Suddenly realizes that it's not the right size, so he can't bolt it back on. So what's he going to do? Do you know what he's going to do? He's going to hold it fast with his legs. So when they land, the wheel's going to touch the runway somehow, some way, somewhere. They're going to have a safe landing. This is the most crazy thing on earth. But you know what? It's all they've got. And that fuel gauge is empty. And the plane starts to glide down to the runway. Everyone's a hero in this story. And the story ends really well. Somehow, that plane from dire straits, money for nothing, comes all the way down to the runway, and everyone survives. Everything survives. The plane is intact. Somehow, the wheels touch the runway. And there's a bit of fighting, there's a bit of yaw, there's a bit of flaps. I have flaps in those days, it's a freaking blind plane. How would I know? The plane's fine, the people are fine. And this goes down in history. 95 years ago, we had no computers, there was no man on the moon, there was no phones, there was no faxes. There were no manifestations of office politics, conflict, firefighting, boardroom meetings, end of play. It was just brute determination. And so on Monday, you've got to be thinking, it's tough, but you know what? Living by comparison is relatively easy. And I want you to think about Al Johnson. And it was Al Jolson, by the way, wasn't it? Not Al Johnson. I want you to think about Al Johnson and how by innovating and thinking of new ideas and thinking around a problem, no problem is insurmountable. And if you can land a plane that in midair loses half of its landing gear, I'm thinking Monday's not going to be so bad after all. I'm Dave Thackeray from Word of Mouth. if you want to get in touch with me, by the way, I'm a writer. So if you want to get in touch with me, have a chat. If you want to get on the show, because this is going to be repeating, whether you like it or not, I enjoy it. And really, what have we learned these days? If you can make yourself happy, chances are you might make one other person happy too. And if you've got 2 people, you might have 3. And if you've got 3, you might have 100. And once you get to 100 true fans, that's when the magic happens. Who knows? Have a fabulous weekend. Thanks for all your time today. Hope you enjoyed the story. And yeah, let's see what next week takes us.